What if the only reason life appears uncertain, resistant, or unstable to you is because your mind has been trained, slowly, quietly, and without your consent, to expect disorder instead of resolution, failure instead of unfolding, and loss instead of alignment? Sit with that question and do not rush past it, because Napoleon Hill understood something that cuts directly through comfort and illusion. The mind does not respond to life as it is, but to life as it is anticipated. Expectation precedes experience. Before events occur, before outcomes form, before circumstances reveal themselves, the mind has already taken a position, and that position determines everything that follows. You do not merely react to reality, you help organize it through the assumptions you repeatedly entertain. To act as if everything always works out is not naive optimism. It is not denial of hardship. It is not pretending that pain, resistance, or loss do not exist. It is a disciplined psychological posture, a conscious internal alignment with order instead of chaos, with resolution instead of collapse, with continuity instead of finality. Hill never taught that success belonged to those who lived in fantasy. He taught that success belonged to those who trained the mind to remain constructive under uncertainty. Most people live as if things will go wrong. They do not say it openly, but their behavior reveals it. They hesitate before committing. They emotionally prepare for disappointment. They rehearse explanations for failure before effort has even begun. They carry an internal posture of defense, as though life is something to survive rather than something to shape. Hill recognized this posture as one of the most destructive habits of thought a human being can possess, because a defensive mind cannot create. It can only react. From childhood, many people are conditioned to expect disappointment. They are taught not to hope too strongly, not to believe too fully, not to commit too deeply. They are told this will protect them from pain. But Hill saw the truth clearly. Preparing for failure does not reduce pain. It multiplies it. It trains the subconscious to anticipate loss, and the subconscious obeys that instruction with ruthless efficiency. It shapes perception, behavior, and decision in alignment with that expectation. The subconscious mind does not reason, it accepts. Whatever you consistently expect with emotion becomes its operating instruction. If you expect life to break you, you will interpret obstacles as verdicts. If you expect efforts to collapse, you will withdraw energy at the moment persistence is required. If you expect things to work out, not magically, but through endurance and adjustment, your mind remains open, adaptive, and engaged. Hill described faith not as belief without evidence, but as expectancy disciplined through repetition. Faith is the assumption that effort compounds, that action produces information, that information enables correction, and that correction leads forward. This chain does not remove difficulty, it removes despair. And despair is what ends most pursuits long before reality ever does. To act as if everything always works out is to assume continuity. It is to assume that no event is final unless you decide it is. Failure becomes feedback. Delay becomes development. Resistance becomes confirmation that something meaningful is being attempted. This posture does not eliminate struggle. It eliminates helplessness. And helplessness, Hill believed, was the true enemy of human potential. Most limiting beliefs are not about ability. They are about anticipation. The belief that effort will not matter, that persistence will not be rewarded, that sacrifice will not justify itself. These beliefs drain energy before action even begins. They turn hesitation into habit. Hill observed that people do not fail because they lack talent, intelligence, or opportunity. They fail because they mentally withdraw while physically present. Definiteness of purpose anchors the expectation that things will work out. When you know exactly what you are pursuing, uncertainty loses its threat. You are no longer wandering, you are navigating. Hill emphasized that a mind without a definite purpose is a mind vulnerable to fear, suggestion, and distraction, but a mind anchored to purpose interprets uncertainty differently. It does not ask whether life will cooperate. It asks how it must adapt. Burning desire gives emotional weight to this expectation. Weak desire collapses under ambiguity. Strong desire treats ambiguity as terrain. Hill insisted that desire must be intense enough to sustain effort without reassurance. Acting as if everything works out is only possible when desire is stronger than fear. Otherwise, the mind defaults to protection instead of pursuit. Autosuggestion trains this expectation deliberately. The mind is always being programmed, either consciously or unconsciously. The question is not whether suggestion is happening, but whose suggestions are being accepted. When you repeatedly impress upon your subconscious the assumption that outcomes resolve through persistence, you remove panic from delay, you remove catastrophe from error. You condition the mind to remain functional under pressure. Most people abandon their efforts not because conditions are unbearable, but because reality fails to match expectation. They expected smoother progress, faster validation, clearer confirmation. When difficulty appears, they interpret it as evidence they were wrong to try. Acting as if everything works out recalibrates. Expectation. Difficulty becomes normal. Delay becomes neutral. Resistance becomes anticipated. This mental posture produces emotional stability, not emotional numbness, but emotional regulation. Panic fragments focus. Calm preserves it, and focus is the currency of achievement. Hill observed that successful individuals were not free from stress, but free from paralysis. They remained mentally coherent under uncertainty. Fear mastery is essential here. Fear thrives on catastrophic expectation. It exaggerates consequence and predicts collapse. When you act as if resolution is inevitable, not because circumstances are kind, but because you are persistent, fear loses its authority. It may still appear, but it no longer dictates behavior. Courage becomes procedural rather than dramatic. Imagination reinforces this posture. When you imagine yourself navigating challenges successfully, recovering from setbacks, and adjusting strategy without collapse, the subconscious begins to accept these scenarios as familiar. Familiarity reduces shock. When adversity arrives, it feels expected rather than overwhelming. The mind remains oriented toward response instead of reaction. Decision-making shifts under this expectation. Indecision weakens when failure is no longer treated as final. You decide more quickly because correction is acceptable. Hill observed that the fear of being wrong paralyzes more people than being wrong ever could. Acting as if everything works out removes the fear of irreversibility. Persistence becomes natural rather than forced. You continue not because you are stubborn, but because stopping feels illogical. Quitting only makes sense when failure is accepted as permanent. When failure is reframed as temporary and instructive, persistence becomes the default. Self-discipline stabilizes this mindset. Discipline ensures that expectation is not undermined by imp. Ulse. Acting as if everything works out does not mean acting recklessly. It means acting consistently, showing up regardless of mood, continuing regardless of applause. Discipline translates expectation into behavior. Hill understood that the invisible forces shaping destiny are psychological laws, not mystical accidents. Expectation influences attention. Attention influences behavior. Behavior influences outcome. When expectation changes, the entire chain shifts. Opportunities are noticed that were previously ignored. Solutions appear where problems once dominated perception. Most people believe life happens to them. Acting as if everything works out assumes participation. It assumes that you are an active variable, not a passive recipient. This assumption alone alters posture, tone, and engagement. The world responds differently to those who expect to endure. This mindset does not remove hardship, it removes surrender. And surrender, Hill believed, was the true cause of defeat. Not circumstances, not opposition, not failure itself, but the internal decision that effort is no longer justified. As this posture deepens, anxiety diminishes, not because outcomes are guaranteed, but because identity is no longer tied to outcome. You trust your capacity to respond. You trust your discipline to persist. You trust your mind to adapt. This trust stabilizes emotion. The mind becomes less reactive. Delays no longer provoke despair. Criticism no longer provokes collapse. Setbacks no longer provoke identity crisis. Everything becomes information. Everything becomes usable. This is mental power. Acting as if everything works out is not arrogance. It is humility toward process. It acknowledges that you do not control events, but you do control response. And response, repeated consistently, shapes trajectory. Napoleon Hill did not teach that success belongs to the lucky. He taught that it belongs to those who refuse to mentally surrender under uncertainty, those who maintain expectancy when evidence is incomplete, those who act decisively without guarantees. This is the foundation. Without it, the mind fractures under pressure. With it, the mind remains coherent. And once coherence is established, deeper laws begin to activate. Laws of persistence, decision, and mental alignment that reshape destiny from the inside outward. This is only the opening movement. The posture you adopt toward life is not a surface attitude. It is not a phrase you repeat or a mood you enter when things feel favorable. It is a silent agreement you make with existence itself. Napoleon Hill understood that long before results are visible, the mind has already decided what kind of world it lives in, either a world that ultimately resolves through effort or a world that collapses under pressure. And whichever assumption dominates will quietly organize perception, emotion, and action to confirm itself. Most people never consciously choose this posture. They inherit it from parents who feared instability, from environments where effort was ridiculed, from experiences where disappointment arrived before understanding. Over time, the mind learns to anticipate loss as a form of self-protection. Hill identified this as one of the most dangerous forms of conditioning because it disguises itself as realism. But realism, when it strips hope of discipline and replaces faith with caution, becomes paralysis. To act as if everything always works out is to reject inherited anticipation. It is to reassert authorship over your internal narrative. Hill emphasized that the mind must be governed deliberately or it will be governed by suggestion. And suggestion is everywhere, in news, in conversation, in social comparison, in repeated stories of failure elevated as wisdom. These suggestions accumulate quietly until expectancy becomes distorted. Expectation is not passive, it is active alignment. It directs attention, it determines what the mind notices and what it dismisses. When you expect collapse, you notice obstacles more vividly than opportunities. When you expect resolution, you notice patterns, connections, and openings that others overlook. This is not magic. It is selective perception guided by belief. Hill taught that the subconscious mind operates as a faithful servant. It does not argue with your assumptions. It executes them. If you consistently expect things to work out through persistence and intelligence, your subconscious organizes behavior to support that assumption. You take risks without panic. You recover quickly from mistakes. You remain mentally present during difficulty. These behaviors compound. The opposite is equally true. When you expect things to fall apart, the subconscious prepares for retreat. Energy is conserved instead of invested. Creativity narrows. Decisions are delayed. The individual appears cautious but is internally disengaged. Hill saw this disengagement as the root of most failure. Not lack of opportunity, but lack of sustained mental presence. Burning desire intensifies expectation. Desire gives emotional weight to belief. Without desire, expectation remains intellectual and collapses under stress. Hill insisted that desire must be strong enough to survive contradiction. When you desire deeply, you interpret resistance differently. You do not ask whether the path is valid. You ask how to continue. Faith stabilizes desire. Faith, as Hill defined it, is the emotional certainty that effort aligns with outcome even when timing is unknown. This certainty allows you to remain calm during delay. Acting as if everything works out is an expression of faith grounded in process rather than fantasy. Rust the law of cause and effect, not luck. Autosuggestion reinforces this posture daily. The mind must be reminded of its chosen assumption until it becomes automatic. Without repetition, old conditioning resurfaces under pressure. Hill advised deliberate internal dialogue, not affirmations spoken casually, but statements impressed with emotion and consistency. You remind the subconscious that obstacles are temporary, that effort compounds, that adjustment is always possible. Persistence transforms expectation into evidence. Each time you continue despite uncertainty, you reinforce the belief that you are capable of enduring. This belief becomes identity. You no longer see yourself as someone who hopes things work out. You see yourself as someone who stays engaged until they do. Identity is more powerful than motivation because it does not require emotional fluctuation. Fear mastery is essential at this stage. Fear does not disappear, it evolves, it becomes quieter, more subtle. It may present as logic, as timing concerns, as strategic caution. Acting as if everything works out requires discernment. You must distinguish between fear disguised as wisdom and wisdom grounded in experience. Hill emphasized that fear must be examined, not avoided. Once examined, its power diminishes. Imagination supports this examination. You visualize yourself encountering resistance and responding effectively. You imagine recovery, adaptation, continuation. This trains the nervous system to remain regulated under stress. When real difficulty appears, it feels familiar. Familiarity reduces emotional shock. Shock is what causes withdrawal. Decision strengthens this posture. Indecision is the enemy of expectancy. When you delay decisions out of fear of error, you reinforce the belief that mistakes are fatal. Acting decisively, even imperfectly, teaches the subconscious that correction possible. This reduces anxiety and increases confidence grounded in behavior rather than fantasy. Self-discipline maintains consistency. Expectation without discipline collapses into wishful thinking. Discipline ensures that behavior aligns with belief even when emotion fluctuates. Hill observed that disciplined individuals rarely panic because their actions are not dictated by mood. They act because action is habitual. As this posture stabilizes, emotional volatility decreases. You no longer experience extreme highs or lows tied to external events. Progress becomes steady rather than dramatic. Hill believed this steadiness was the true marker of mental mastery. Not excitement, but endurance. The invisible forces Hill described begin to respond because consistency attracts alignment. People respond differently to those who remain composed under pressure. Opportunities emerge through reliability. Trust forms. Momentum builds. These effects are subtle but cumulative. Acting as if everything works out does not guarantee comfort. It guarantees continuity. It ensures that effort does not collapse prematurely. And most achievements are lost not to opposition, but to abandonment. This mental posture prepares you for deeper confrontation, because as expectation strengthens, so does responsibility. You can no longer blame uncertainty for hesitation. You can no longer excuse withdrawal as prudence. You know that continuation is possible, and knowing removes innocence. This is the transition point, where belief begins to demand proof through behavior, where philosophy must be lived rather than admired, where the mind must demonstrate its alignment under pressure, and pressure will come. Pressure does not announce itself with drama. It arrives quietly, disguised as routine fatigue, delayed feedback, unanswered effort, and the slow erosion of certainty. Napoleon Hill understood that the true battlefield is not the moment of visible crisis, but the prolonged period where nothing seems to move, where effort produces no immediate confirmation, and where the mind begins to question whether continuation is rational. This is where most people abandon their aims, not in despair, but in resignation. And resignation is far more dangerous than fear because it feels reasonable. When you act as if everything always works out, you are not denying this phase. You are redefining it. You are training yourself to recognize stagnation not as a signal to withdraw, but as a required interval between cause and effect. Hill emphasized repeatedly that nature never produces results instantly. Seeds germinate underground. Foundations are built below the surface. The impatient observer mistakes invisibility for absence. The disciplined thinker understands that unseen processes are still processes. The mind, however, resists waiting. It demands evidence, it craves reassurance, and when reassurance is not provided, it invents narratives. These narratives are rarely neutral. They lean toward pessimism because pessimism feels protective. If you expect disappointment, you believe you are cushioning yourself from shock. Hill saw this as one of the great psychological traps. Expecting failure does not reduce pain. It merely ensures disengagement before success has time to emerge. To continue under pressure, expectation must be insulated from immediate feedback. You must be able to operate without applause, without validation, without proof that you are on the right path. Acting as if everything works out is the psychological mechanism that allows this insulation. It keeps the mind oriented forward even when the environment offers no encouragement. This orientation is not blind persistence. It is intelligent endurance. You continue while observing. You adjust, while remaining committed. You remain flexible without becoming fragile. Hill taught that rigidity is as dangerous as surrender. Acting as if everything works out does not mean insisting on a single method. It means insisting on the outcome while remaining adaptable in approach. Adaptability requires imagination, not fantasy, but strategic imagination. You must be able to envision alternate routes without interpreting the need for adjustment as failure. Many people collapse at this point because they confuse adaptation with defeat. They believe changing strategy means admitting they were wrong. Hill rejected this completely. He taught that the successful mind values results over ego. It abandons methods quickly, but never abandons purpose. Fear resurfaces here in subtler forms. It may appear as exhaustion, as boredom, as a sudden desire for comfort. The mind begins to romanticize easier paths, safer options, quieter lives. These thoughts feel harmless. They are not. They are invitations to retreat disguised as self-care. Acting as if everything works out requires discernment. You must learn the difference between necessary rest and convenient withdrawal. Hill warned that many people quit not because they are incapable, but because they misinterpret fatigue as finality. Self-discipline governs this distinction. Discipline does not mean cruelty toward the self. It means honesty. It means refusing to lie to yourself about why you are slowing down. It means maintaining standards even when motivation is absent. Hill observed that motivation is unreliable. Discipline is structural. It remains when emotion fluctuates. As discipline strengthens, the internal dialogue changes. You no longer ask whether you should continue. You ask how. This shift is profound. It removes negotiation from effort. When continuation is assumed, energy is spent on refinement rather than justification. The mind becomes quieter because it is no longer arguing with itself. This quiet is often mistaken for confidence. It is deeper than that. It is coherence, the alignment of belief, intention, and action. When coherence is present, stress becomes manageable, not because pressure disappears, but because internal contradiction does. Hill believed that internal contradiction was the primary source of mental fatigue. The invisible forces he described respond to coherence. Opportunities align not because of luck, but because clarity attracts relevance. When you are clear about what you are building, information related to that aim becomes visible. People who can assist appear. Patterns emerge. This is not mysticism, it is focus. Most people miss these signals because they are mentally fragmented. They are pursuing goals while doubting them. They are acting while anticipating retreat. Their attention is divided. Acting as if everything works out unifies attention. It removes the background noise of doubt. The mind becomes sensitive to subtle feedback. Persistence under these conditions becomes self-reinforcing. Each day you continue without collapse strengthens the belief that you are capable of enduring. This belief becomes identity, and identity governs behavior more powerfully than desire ever could. You no longer need to convince yourself to continue. Continuation feels natural. At this stage, fear of failure transforms into respect for consequence. You understand that actions matter, that decisions compound, that time is not neutral. This respect sharpens focus. It does not paralyze, it clarifies. Hill insisted that this level of mental control is rare because it requires sustained effort without visible reward. It requires acting on principle rather than emotion. It requires trusting laws that operate slowly. But those who reach this level experience a FT that feels irreversible. They can no longer return to passive anticipation. They have tasted agency. Agency changes how setbacks are experienced. A setback is no longer an identity threat. It is a logistical problem. This distinction preserves dignity. You do not collapse emotionally because your sense of self is no longer tied to immediate outcome. You trust your capacity to respond. Acting as if everything works out ultimately teaches the mind that survival is not the goal. Expression is, growth is, contribution is. When survival is no longer the primary concern, courage becomes accessible, not heroic courage, but practical courage, the courage to continue doing what must be done. This is the deep conditioning Hill sought to instill, not hope, not optimism, but mental resilience grounded in expectation. The expectation that effort is meaningful, that persistence alters trajectory, that intelligence combined with endurance produces results over time. As this expectation stabilizes, something subtle occurs. The mind stops scanning for escape routes. It stops asking how to minimize loss. It begins asking how to maximize impact. This shift changes everything. Energy increases. Creativity expands. Engagement deepens. You are no longer acting as if everything works out because you need reassurance. You are acting that way because it reflects how you now understand reality. You have seen enough evidence in your own behavior to trust the process. You have endured enough uncertainty to know you can endure more. And with this knowledge comes a deeper demand, because once you know you can persist, you are no longer allowed to pretend you cannot. Responsibility increases. Excuses lose credibility. Comfort loses authority. This is the threshold where philosophy becomes destiny, where mental posture begins to sculpt life in visible ways, where internal order produces external momentum. And this momentum is not loud. It is steady. It does not announce itself. It accumulates. What follows is not ease, but inevitability. Inevitability is not a feeling. It is a structure. It is built slowly, invisibly, through repeated acts of alignment between thought and behavior. Napoleon Hill understood that when a person reaches this stage, life no longer feels random, not because uncertainty disappears, but because the individual no longer experiences themselves as subject to it. They have crossed from reaction into authorship, and authorship changes the meaning of every event. At this level, acting as if everything always works out is no longer a conscious technique. It is a settled assumption embedded in identity. The mind has been conditioned through experience, not hope, through endurance, not fantasy. You have stayed present long enough, persisted long enough, adjusted long enough to see patterns emerge that others never witness because they quit too early. This observation creates conviction deeper than belief. It creates knowing. Hill believed that knowing is the most powerful mental state available to a human being. Belief can be shaken. Hope can fade. Knowing, once earned, is unmovable. It does not depend on mood. It does not require reassurance. It is built from evidence accumulated through disciplined action under pressure. When you know that you can continue, that you can adapt, that you can recover, the fear of uncertainty loses its leverage. This is where mental warfare becomes subtle. The enemy is no longer obvious doubt or fear. It is complacency. It is the temptation to relax standards because things feel more stable. Hill warned that many individuals lose momentum not during struggle, but during relative calm. When progress begins to appear, discipline often weakens. The mind assumes the work is done. But this assumption, dangerous. Momentum requires maintenance. Self-discipline at this stage is no longer about forcing action. It is about preserving sharpness, about refusing to let routine dull intention. Acting as if everything works out does not mean assuming progress will continue automatically. It means assuming responsibility for sustaining it. You remain vigilant over your thoughts, your habits, your decisions. You do not drift. Decision-making becomes increasingly important here. As options expand, the risk of dispersion increases. Hill emphasized that definiteness of purpose must be protected more fiercely as opportunity grows. Many people confuse opportunity with alignment. They pursue every opening and dilute their energy. Acting as if everything works out requires selectivity. You choose deliberately. You say no without guilt. You commit without apology. Imagination now operates at a higher level. It is no longer used primarily to survive adversity, but to shape direction. You envision outcomes with precision. You anticipate second-order effects. You think in systems rather than events. This kind of imagination is strategic. It allows you to move ahead of circumstances rather than chase them. Faith evolves as well. It becomes less emotional and more structural. You trust not because you feel inspired, but because you understand process. You have seen enough cause and effect to know that effort, intelligently applied over time, produces leverage. This faith is calm. It does not seek validation. It is content with consistency. Fear, when it appears now, is informative rather than paralyzing. It signals areas of growth. It highlights edges of comfort. You do not obey it, but you listen. Hill taught that fear contains data. When examined, it reveals where the mind still clings to limitation. Acting as if everything works out means using fear as a diagnostic tool, not a DI.
Corrective.
Persistence becomes quieter, less dramatic. You no longer need to prove anything. You simply continue. This continuation is not blind. It is observant. You measure progress. You refine method. You eliminate waste. You become efficient not to avoid effort, but to honor it. At this stage, the invisible forces Hill described become increasingly tangible, not in mystical ways, but in relational ones. People respond to clarity. They trust consistency. They align with those who demonstrate steadiness under pressure. Networks form, resources appear, timing improves. These effects are not accidental. They are responses to coherence. Coherence is rare. Most people live fragmented lives. Their thoughts contradict their actions. Their desires contradict their habits. Their words contradict their commitments. Acting as if everything works out requires internal congruence. When congruence is present, friction decreases. Energy flows more efficiently. Progress accelerates, yet acceleration introduces risk. The risk of arrogance, the risk of overconfidence. Hill cautioned that humility must be preserved, not humility as self-doubt, but humility as respect for law. You do not believe you are exempt from effort. You do not believe success makes you invulnerable. You remain obedient to discipline. This obedience is not submission, it is alignment. You align with principles that have proven themselves through experience. You no longer question whether persistence matters. You question how to apply it more intelligently. You no longer question whether belief influences outcome. You question how to refine belief to support higher aims. Acting as if everything works out now carries weight. It means you accept consequences fully. You no longer blame circumstances for results. You evaluate decisions. You adjust behavior. Responsibility becomes total, and total responsibility, both heavy and liberating. Heavy because there is nowhere to hide, liberating because there is nothing to wait for. Hill believed that this acceptance of responsibility is the dividing line between those who merely study success and those who embody it. Once responsibility is accepted without resentment, action becomes clean. You do not act to prove. You act to build. You do not react to pressure. You respond to purpose. Purpose deepens here. It moves beyond personal gain. You begin to see your work as expression rather than acquisition. Contribution replaces validation. This shift stabilizes motivation. You are no longer dependent on outcome for meaning. Meaning is generated through alignment with purpose. This internal stability allows you to withstand larger challenges. As capacity increases, so do demands. Life tests expansion. Hill noted that growth invites pressure, not as punishment, but as calibration. Acting as if everything works out prepares you to meet this pressure without collapse. The mind at this stage is no longer dramatic. It is deliberate. It does not rush. It does not stall. It moves steadily. Emotion is present but governed. Thought is active but disciplined. This is mental maturity. You now understand that success is not a destination. It is a posture maintained over time, a way of thinking, deciding, and acting that produces continuity. Acting as if everything works out is not a slogan. It is the operating system of this posture. And yet this is not the end, because with stability comes a final test, the test of commitment without novelty, of discipline without urgency, of purpose without crisis. This is where many drift. What comes next demands something deeper still. When urgency disappears, when the fire of crisis no longer forces attention, the mind is exposed in a way far more dangerous than panic ever was. Napoleon Hill understood that the greatest threat to long-term success is not adversity, but comfort without consciousness. When survival is no longer in question, discipline must become deliberate rather than reactive. And this is where most people quietly abandon their destiny without ever realizing they have done so. Acting as if everything always works out now enters its most demanding phase, not because resistance increases, but because resistance becomes subtle. There is no external pressure insisting that you continue, no immediate consequence for slowing down, no obvious penalty for drifting. The world does not punish stagnation quickly, it allows it. And allowance is seductive. Hill observed that many individuals reach a level of stability, competence, and partial success, then unconsciously negotiate with their standards. They begin to justify inconsistency. They allow minor lapses. They delay difficult decisions because nothing appears to be breaking yet. This is the slow decay of greatness, not dramatic failure, but gradual dilution of intent. At this stage, belief must evolve again. Acting as if everything works out can no longer mean trusting that persistence will rescue you. It must mean trusting that vigilance is required even when things appear fine. The mind must remain alert without being alarmed, focused without being frantic. This balance is rare. Self-discipline here becomes a form of respect. Respect for the effort already invested, respect for the identity already built, respect for the potential that would be betrayed by complacency. Hill believed that discipline was not about control, but about honoring one's own future. You do not maintain standards because you fear loss. You maintain them because you value what you are becoming. The internal dialogue changes again. It is no longer about encouragement. It is about accountability. You do not ask whether you feel like continuing. You ask whether your actions align with who you have decided to be. This question cuts through mood, fatigue, and distraction. It restores coherence quickly. Purpose must be revisited regularly here, not questioned, but reaffirmed. Hill warned that purpose can fade into routine if not consciously renewed. When purpose becomes background noise, action loses precision. Acting as if everything works out requires keeping purpose in the foreground of thought. You remind yourself why the discipline matters, why the effort matters, why retreat, even subtle retreat, is unacceptable. Imagination is used now to prevent stagnation. You envision higher standards, deeper contribution, greater mastery, not to create pressure, but to prevent contraction. The mind either expands or shrinks. It does not remain neutral. Acting as if everything works out means choosing expansion deliberately. Fear at this level is almost unrecognizable. It appears as reluctance to disrupt comfort, as hesitation to risk stability for growth, as rational arguments for staying where you are. Hill identified this as one of the most dangerous fears because it feels reasonable. It does not shout. It whispers. It tells you that you have done enough. To master this fear, you must redefine security. True security is not the absence of challenge. It is the confidence that you can meet challenge. When you stop challenging yourself, you weaken the very capacity that creates security. Acting as if everything works out requires understanding this paradox deeply. Decision-making becomes more strategic. You choose growth even when maintenance would be easier. You initiate change before stagnation forces it. Hill emphasized that proactive decision is a mark of leadership over self. You not wait for dissatisfaction to justify action. You act because alignment demands it. Persistence now expresses itself as consistency of standards rather than intensity of effort. You show up with the same level of care regardless of external conditions. You do not relax quality because no one is watching. You do not compromise principles because consequences are delayed. This consistency reinforces identity. The invisible forces Hill described respond powerfully here, because very few people maintain discipline without pressure. Reliability becomes rare, trust deepens, influence expands, not because you seek it, but because stability attracts responsibility. At this stage, acting as if everything works out also means accepting that not everything will feel rewarding. Some efforts will feel repetitive, some days will feel flat. Meaning must be generated internally rather than extracted from excitement. Hill believed that this capacity separated professionals from amateurs, masters from beginners. You no longer chase motivation, you create structure. You design your environment to support discipline. You remove unnecessary friction. You simplify decisions. You conserve willpower by making standards non-negotiable. This is mental economy. The mind becomes less dramatic, more precise. You measure progress honestly. You acknowledge shortcomings without self-punishment. You correct without delay. You do not indulge in self-praise. You do not indulge in self-pity. Both are distractions. Acting as if everything works out now carries an ethical dimension. You understand that your consistency affects others, that your reliability creates stability beyond yourself. Hill believed that leadership begins with self-governance. When you govern yourself well, others feel it. This awareness deepens responsibility further. You are no longer accountable only to your goals, but to the standard you represent. This does not inflate ego. It humbles. It reminds you that discipline is no personal virtue alone. It is contribution. As this realization settles, the mind becomes anchored, not rigid, but grounded. You are no longer pulled by trends, opinions, or moods. You are guided by principle. Acting as if everything works out is now synonymous with acting in alignment with law, mental law, behavioral law, cause and effect. This alignment produces a quiet authority. You do not need to assert confidence. It is evident in your steadiness. You do not need to argue for belief. It is evident in your behavior. You do not need to prove resilience. It is evident in your continuity. And yet one final confrontation remains, the confrontation with total ownership, with the understanding that there are no remaining external barriers, that whatever remains undone is a matter of decision, not destiny. This realization is sobering because it removes all remaining refuge. What follows is the final demand of Hill's philosophy. There comes a point where every idea, every philosophy, every explanation loses its usefulness because what remains is not something to be understood, but something to be executed. Napoleon Hill understood that the final barrier between an individual and the life they claim to want is not lack of knowledge, lack of opportunity, or lack of ability, but the refusal to assume full command of their own mind. And this refusal is subtle. It disguises itself as patience, as preparation, as waiting for the right moment. But beneath every delay lies a decision not yet made. Acting as if everything always works out reaches its most severe meaning here. It no longer refers to confidence or expectation. It refers to authority, authority over thought, authority over emotional response, authority over habit, authority over direction. At this stage, you either accept that authority completely or you surrender it unconsciously and live with the cons, consequences. There is no middle ground. Hill never spoke gently at this point in his philosophy because gentleness invites negotiation, and negotiation is how the mind escapes responsibility. He made it clear that the mind, once trained, demands obedience, not obedience to impulse, not obedience to fear, but obedience to purpose. Without this obedience, every principle collapses into theory. By now, you know exactly what happens when you hesitate. You have seen the cost of delay. You have experienced the quiet erosion that follows inconsistency. You have felt the dissatisfaction that comes from knowing you could have acted differently. This awareness is not meant to shame you. It is meant to eliminate confusion. You are no longer guessing. You are no longer experimenting. You are choosing. Acting as if everything works out now means that you no longer wait for reassurance before acting. You no longer require emotional certainty before committing. You no longer demand guarantees before moving. You move because movement is required. You act because action is the only remaining proof of belief. Hill insisted that belief without action is not belief at all. It is preference. At this level, fear does not disappear. It is demoted. It becomes a physical sensation rather than a governing force. The body may resist. The mind does not comply. Courage is no longer emotional intensity. It is behavioral consistency. You do what must be done regardless of how it feels, because you have learned that feeling follows action, not the other way around. Faith becomes procedural. It is embedded in systems, routines, and standards that do not fluctuate with mood. You no longer rely on inspiration. You rely on structure. Hill taught that the disciplined mind outperforms the inspired mind because discipline remains when inspiration fades. Acting as if everything works out means building a life that does not require constant emotional fuel to function. Persistence becomes identity. You are no longer someone who tries and stops. You are someone who continues. This continuation is not dramatic. It is quiet, relentless, and indifferent to recognition. You do not persist to prove anything. You persist because stopping would contradict who you are. Self-discipline reaches its highest form here. It is no longer restraint. It is clarity. You do not waste energy debating whether to act. You act. You do not waste energy indulging doubt. You observe it and proceed. You do not waste energy explaining yourself. You execute. Imagination now serves vision with precision. You see not only what you are building, but the kind of person required to build it. And you hold yourself to that standard daily. Not harshly, but honestly. You remove behaviors that dilute focus. You eliminate habits that weaken resolve. You protect your mind from influences that encourage passivity. At this stage, the invisible forces Hill described are no longer theoretical. Cause and effect have become personal. You have seen how thought shapes emotion, how emotion shapes behavior, and how behavior shapes outcome. You understand that nothing external changes until something internal stabilizes. This understanding removes superstition from success. It replaces hope with method. You now recognize that most people do not fail dramatically. They fade. They drift. They compromise quietly until their life no longer reflects their potential. Acting as if everything works out means refusing to fade. It means refusing to drift. It means refusing to become careless with your own capacity. Responsibility becomes total. You no longer blame environment, history, or circumstance. Not because they do not exist, but because they do not decide. You decide every day. In thought, in focus, in effort. Hill believed this acceptance of responsibility was the highest form of freedom available to a human being. With this freedom comes pressure, because there is nowhere left to hide. You cannot pretend you do not know what to do. You cannot pretend the work is unclear. You cannot pretend that time will decide for you. Time only reveals the consequences of your decisions. Acting as if everything works out now means acting as if your decisions matter completely, because they do. It means treating each day as a vote for the life you are building. It means understanding that consistency compounds and inconsistency destroys momentum faster than failure ever could. You no longer wait for the world to change. You change your standards. You no longer wait for motivation. You act from commitment. You no longer wait for clarity. You move and allow clarity to emerge from action. Hill emphasized that clarity is a reward for movement, not a prerequisite. This is where most people stop reading, because this is where excuses die. This is where comfort is exposed as a liability. This is where responsibility becomes unavoidable. And this is exactly where transformation begins. From here forward, there are no new ideas coming to save you. There is only repetition, daily execution, unseen effort, quiet correction, long stretches without validation. This is the price of self-mastery, and it must be paid in advance. You must now decide whether you are willing to pay it, not once, not when it feels meaningful, not when progress is obvious, but every day, especially when it does not feel meaningful. Especially when progress is invisible, especially when comfort tempts you to slow down. Napoleon Hill's philosophy does not ask if you are capable. It assumes you are. It asks whether you are willing to govern your thoughts, willing to discipline your emotions, willing to persist when retreat would be easier, willing to accept full responsibility for the results of your choices, because from this point on, the truth is unavoidable. If you act deliberately, life aligns. If you hesitate, life fragments. If you persist, outcomes resolve. If you retreat, limitations solidify. There is no cruelty in this law, only precision. Now you stand at the only place that ever mattered, not at the beginning, not at the end, but at the decision that repeats itself daily. So decide now without drama and without delay. Decide that your mind will no longer be ruled by fear, impulse, or inherited limitation. Decide that your purpose will not be negotiated away for comfort. Decide that discipline will not depend on mood. Decide that persistence will not depend on praise. Decide that your life will be built intentionally or not at all. Act as if everything always works out, not because you are hoping, but because you are committing. Commit to thought control. Commit to emotional mastery. Commit to relentless, intelligent action. Commit to staying present when it would be easier to withdraw. Commit to carrying full responsibility for your future without resentment or excuse. Remove every remaining escape. Withdraw loyalty from every limiting belief. End all negotiation with hesitation. And step forward now, not as someone seeking reassurance, but as someone who has decided to take absolute ownership of their life, their purpose, and the consequences of both. Starting now.